I think we were very pleased with Valentin because it seems that the dramaturgy of the whole conference is at place. And thank you very much for your amazing research and your amazing talks today. And I was amazed, and on the other hand, I was thinking, oh my God, what shall I ask? But then, because it's so detailed, it's so elaborate, and all the motivations behind it in both processes are unveiled. But on the other hand, I think that your two brilliant cases, they pose a question which is very important to us and which are very in regard to the previous panels. What do I mean? I mean that if we agree that there is a big amount in the storage and there is still ahead a big amount to be explored and analyzed, and on the other hand, there is a methodology how to explore it, which Lukash presented very carefully, and also your methodology is Vladislav's methodology, which is more artistic one. But what you described in details, in very detail, that it's an open question, and you precede the result, but it's in the mark on the borders of various fields. So my question is, how you imagine, or you do not imagine at all, the result, and where can you stop? Because I think a big question of an ongoing research and also for an archive, which moment do you stop, or which moment do you feel satisfaction, or which moment you feel here is a result? Or maybe this moment doesn't come at all.
Right, I mean, as I wanted to emphasize, where you do not stop is in national histories. I think that this is a story, I think both our stories are stories about various types of global imaginations. And I think that the one thing which I resisted doing is to focus on one particular national history and how it was somehow globally exported. I think there is I started this project 9 years ago, and since then there has been research which was developed, and I definitely benefit from this research, but almost always it is a research about a specific country, a Yugoslav export or Polish export. And I am so the strategic decision, and this has everything to do with your question, because the decision about the selection of data and the kind of giving weight on question was, to look at these stories from the outside, which are those 5 cities. And I think that once I have defined the 5 cities, which of course required a lot of research around, and I have materials about many other cities, as you can imagine. But once I have defined those 5 cities as points which are for several reasons important, and I could elaborate why they are important, but I'm not going to do that now, then it actually became crystal clear, where do I look and where do I stop? And so the question of, the impact on the ground, the questions on the current views of Ghanaians or Nigerians on these matters, are really important. When I came to Lagos to my research, I was invited to give a talk there, and it was an amazing experience because around 80 to 200 people came, and it turned out that one of the architects on whom I worked is still taught in architectural schools in the whole country, in Nigeria. So in other words, this and that is for me one crucial criterion to look at a person like that, rather than to follow certain ideas and hierarchies from Europe of who might be important. So in other words, for instance, I'm not, and I will finish with that, I'm not really interested in who of these architects collaborated with Le Corbusier, right? Which would be an important criterion while looking from a European types of architectural history. That is not my question.
So, if to sum up before it goes to...
Can I try?
Yeah.
I think that the point of stop when things will disappear, because things should disappear. I think that we should not get obsessed with all this stuff. I mean, with archiving. That's important, but time passes, and it's normal. Things are disappearing. That's why I'm trying to find sense in the fact that these materials, I mean, they're lost, but that's not the point. The point is that the histories are untold, so you should remediate them in a certain way. How do you remediate an exhibition? If you are doing an exhibition, which kind of display you build? Because, for example, a couple of weeks ago, this archive where I worked in Milan, it was thrown away by the city of Milan. It's a historical association, Italy-USSR, founded in 46. They survived until 91. 91, USSR collapses. They survive until 2017, and the place where I've been filming in July do not exist anymore. So all this stuff just repacked somewhere in one room to move in the room X, in the building X. And this is very sad. It's a drama and a tragedy, but at the same time, maybe it's okay. So that will be the point of stop. So you should not keep everything, you should remediate and think about display. If you're working with exhibition, we saw a lot of, think about images. So we had today a lot of images of storages. We had a lot of kind of infographic-like displays, which are telling the stories. Is it the right medium? How do you work? Do you print it? Do you film it? You screen it? You show it? Which kind of space? How you do it? This kind of questions, because that's how knowledge works. It's a living language. If you don't speak on a certain language, language disappears. So if exhibition is not exhibited, it just disappears. These images could be stored forever, but what's the sense? I mean, yeah, it should disappear. That will be the stop, where we stop the research.
Okay, so there are hands in the room. Wow, so many hands. Who's the first? Kate, I think. No, or just for somebody else, okay. У Юли был вопрос.
I have a question to Vladislav. Are there original negatives for these images, and where are they kept? And the second one, your very interesting idea about that neglect is an advantage, and you elaborated a little bit on it now. Can you talk a little more about it?
The negatives, basically, no one knows, because, for example, you have an exhibition, you have a folder. The folder is this size, 30 on 40. It's not just a random thing. It's standard size for the printing of photographs in 58, for example, because if it's bigger, it's difficult to transport. It has to be sent somewhere. So you can take it with you, move somewhere else, and install. So they choose this size, and it's prints, because if you send negatives somewhere, I mean, a person needs to go somewhere else to print them. It's getting a bit complicated. So if we want to build efficient exhibition making strategy, I will send you prints and the diagram how to do it, and you do it, that's all. So negatives could be somewhere in Moscow. Probably. They will be in all these agencies, kind of RIA Novosti and all these kind of things, because if you will try to trace it back, you will go back to TASS. From TASS you will go back to, I don't know, something else, so Sov photo production something, and in this way back to 25. But again, negatives, they do not live forever, so I think it's just rotten, because it's a celluloid thing.
Yeah, Bill's film today is about that.
Even these prints, they are like wet, they're like that, because you have the gelatin. They will just disappear. So, I mean, they're not in Italy, they're not in Austria, and they're not in Morocco. They're somewhere else. Probably they just disappeared.
Hey, there is another question.
What's interesting about this session that's different from the others is that you've both, it's called Data Travels, but actually you were both talking about a fixed period in time, roughly. You know, i.e. the Socialist International period, the 1950s. So I want to ask you, apart from the changes in technology, the way that you're looking at this period through the archives that are available now, do you think that there's a different way that we can look at the same period of time in 50 years' time? i.e., with a fixed period of time, as people who are interested in doing research into it, do you think it changes if somebody who is like currently not born and then wants to look into it when they're in their 30s or 40s? apart from the kind of digital technologies that you might change the way that you work, do you think that there's another way that you might look at something in the future you would look at it differently?
Well, maybe to add to that, one of the ambitions of the project I presented is actually to start with the 50s, but to reach the current period, at least the 1990s. So, and because I think what is really counterintuitive is to find out, which I have presented in one of my slides, that the town hall of Abu Dhabi is a Bulgarian project. That is not something one would expect, because, in a country which is the UAE, which did not have diplomatic relationships at that time, in the 1980s, with any socialist countries. Okay, so that is I think that the story, one of the new things which probably we realize better today than we realized 20 years ago is the fact that so much from the Cold War actually persisted beyond the Cold War. I think that, I was born in a country where in 1990 a lot of people were working very hard to pretend that communism never happened. And so I think there is, one needs to have a certain historical distance actually to accept these things. And to respond to your question, I think that, I can imagine that starting this project again, so, taking 9 years from now, so working in the future, what I would change is probably to work harder on making Europe irrelevant. I think that the focus from West Africa, the focus from the actual agencies and actors on the ground is something which is not only more interesting, but is actually much more close to what actually happened, rather to see this in terms of, those terms of export, for instance, or to emphasize or to overemphasize the Cold War dynamics, the kind of the proxy type of dynamics. I think that the more I go to this region and study archives there, it becomes more and more clear that the agency was much more intertwined, much more subtle, which doesn't mean that they did that socialist countries had no impact. Obviously they did, that's the project. But the way how it was mediated, I think needs to be seen from not from major institutional archives in Europe.
I would support this claim to make Europe irrelevant, and even more to decompose the normalized narratives of the Cold War, this bipolar thing and so on, because everything is more nuanced and more complex, and it's not just, some peaceful first world exchanging exhibitions because people were dying somewhere. It was not that cold, and it's still very much present, because all this story with North Korea, it's basically the direct continuation, because the conflict between South and North Korea, that's the first hot military conflict of Cold War. Everything started. It's still very much ongoing in different forms, so it has to be read differently, all these things, not between USSR and United States and all these kind of things. And the question of future, wow, it's super important. Working with Italian context, I found this beautiful book of Paolo Virno, Deja Vu, and there is a quotation, and he says that past and potential, and we used to position potential somewhere in the future, something that could happen. That indeed relationships between past and potential are much closer than we think. So this linear temporality, maybe it's not that. Maybe potential is in the past. So how do you reread past? And that's very much will condition and determine your future. So I think that all these struggles for the past, they're very much happens somewhere in background. And how do we read past? How do we see it? So that's the future. And the question again, future in technical terms, I think again obsolescence is beautiful. No one would do now photographic exhibition. I mean, people still do it, but I think that photography does not exist anymore. And I'm asking myself, is exhibition still present? Is it a medium? Is there any need to do an exhibition if you want to show something or to communicate? So, I mean, with photography, it's clear what's the future. With exhibition, it's still a question.
And there is a hand from David. Valentin, if you don't mind. So.
I mean, just following this point, I wanted a slightly more speculative version of what you were just talking about in terms of the what might be described as an unequal distribution of knowledge production. And Lucas, you talked very interestingly about this kind of redistribution of that during the period you're talking about. I wondered if there's scope for reconceptualizing what we understand as an archive. If, say, the archives we use are accumulated in certain historical centers, and due to processes such as colonialism, they are not accumulated elsewhere. Then, can we consider other practices and knowledges as archives that might, reset that balance?
No, absolutely. I mean, I worked a lot with private archives, so I was sympathetic to many of the things which were said before. Because I very rarely work with artists, but I work with architects, and so I work a lot with private archives and architects, both in Europe and outside Europe, and so that is a whole ritual of accessing those archives, I do think that the really crucial moment here to understand is that the fundamental lack of completeness of an archive, and again, Baghdad. I have chosen Baghdad. I could be talking about other cities, but I have chosen Baghdad because I think Baghdad is a really evident place where you all know why archives in Baghdad are incomplete. Right, something happened in 1990, and then a couple of other things happened since then. So actually, those plans are not there in Baghdad. To the best of my knowledge, I am in touch with I collaborate with the School of Architecture in Baghdad, and we were very active in providing some of the materials from Europe to them, which concerns their own city, because they are not there. At least, maybe there are somewhere in a private archive, but professionals do not have these archives. I think that question of a dispersion of knowledge, which has to do with the original places where this knowledge was produced, that question of the incompleteness of the archive as a fundamental condition, which can't be sort of undone, and it's not like an ideal to think beyond an incompleteness. It's a basic condition. I think that starting from that's the starting point, right? And then once you look at that, once you think about the incompleteness, then you start identifying your possible networks, which are sometimes completely counterintuitive, like questions of military maps were crucial. So infrastructural maps, sewerage networks becomes a crucial document from the 1970s in Baghdad. So I think it's both about looking in the various places, not simply geographically, but also beyond the discipline of urban histories or architectural histories or art history.
So we have 2 minutes, and there is a hand from the audience. So Valentina will ask in private.
Thanks for both presentations. I have a question for Vladislav. So you were talking about these archives and the exhibitions as very depersonalized like result of like negotiations between empires and so on. So is there like personal history? Do we know, for example, names of these photo artists, and is this question even like relatable to you?
I understood the question. I left out of the focus many details of these materials. I was so syndromized with the timing, so I just left everything aside. They are depersonalized from the very beginning because all these images, they are stripped of authors. Rarely you have any captions. Where is it, which kind of image, and so on. There are no names of curators. Sometimes you know where they've been assembled. If you're looking in Russian archives, because I did this kind of cross research, like working with materials in Italy and going back and looking in the real archives of works, like all this background. They're preparing stuff to send to them. So, and they speak, of course, with the photo artists, like with photo художник. So they have a photographer somewhere in Kiev, and they commission him. Could you go there and produce? They give him a shooting script, actually, what to do and how. He just produced this stuff. In 30s and 20s, photographers, they're trading because they know, and there is all, again, this question of quality, because it's it's for Westerners, growing up in the Western visual culture, so it should be printed on a good paper. So Vox is buying good paper abroad, moving it somewhere, commissioning a guy in Kiev. He's producing images, printing, sending. It's like super complex. And of course, this guy, he's losing his authorship. Sometimes they keep his authorship, and that's how Soviet photographers very often got these long Western CVs with all these exhibitions. Because you think, okay, but how is it possible? He never went abroad, these 25 exhibitions. Because sometimes the Vox been contacted by, because 20th century is proliferation of the photographic medium. People, you have these photo enthusiasts everywhere around the world. So they start to exchange. They propose, okay, send us some pictures on this topic, on that topic. We will do a show. We'll make a catalog, and we will send it back to the authors. So in this case, name is preserved. In others, just cancel, disappear. So, I mean, they're without authorship. I mean, it's not really curators did them, editors, maybe, photo editors. But again, there are no names.
Please, one more question.
I actually have time for one more question. I think Vladis has answered it a bit right now, but I'm curious for you both, working with state archives, what are you sure, what important documents are you sure that they lack? And you talked about something that is clearly not there, what should be there to complement the research. What is the most significant vacuum in the amount of documents that you both work with?
All right, I think one of the things I always look for and are extremely difficult to get are actual contracts between the architects or the design institutes, because of course, as in terms of architecture, the dominant actors were aggregate actors. They were not individuals. They were design institutes in a socialist culture. And of course, again, that varied from country to country, but in general, it's fair to say that the dominant actors were aggregate actors. And so I really look at very specific contracts which define which allows a glance into the political economy of that production, which I argue is crucial to to understand the specificity of that mobility. I'm quite often asked, okay, was there something specific in this socialist architecture? Can you see this is an architecture which comes from a socialist country? And my response to that question is that you can't see it in the shape of windows, rarely even in the programs, but you can see it in the conditions of labor of the architects, and these conditions of labor came with specific opportunities and constraints. And for instance, one opportunity was that these architects could stay for a prolonged time on the ground, and hence their methodologies were more empirical. And you see this very much in the master plan of Baghdad, which is really the first master plan which mapped correctly the city on the ground. And that is why, because I'm interested in the conditions of labor, I'm interested in the contracts, and they are very rarely there.
I'm missing feedback, how people saw these things, how they saw these exhibitions. Sometimes, very rarely, producers of the show from both Soviet part or from American part, it was much more developed in US because the United States Information Agency, traveling family of men, been collecting visitors' comments to understand what do they see actually, because you never understand, okay, you put up the show, you did it, you never get what do they see. And they collect comments in Moscow, in Belgrade, for example, and people are writing that I see this exhibition as a great contribution to communism, because they read an idea of kind of common humanity, family of men, as yeah, absolutely, indeed, just, yeah, we are. It's very strange. Sometimes some friendship associations are sending back feedbacks. They just describe, and they're sending that white immigrants, like the notorious anti-communists, are coming to these exhibitions. Been noticed, notorious local anti-communists from white immigration. So I'm missing sometimes, I mean, apart that everything is fragmented.
Yes.
Looking at this, I miss documentation of the shows. I cannot reconstruct the spaces. I don't understand what was going on with display. But the feedback, perception.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I would like to remind that we welcome you here at 7, and there will be a Russian premiere of Bill Morrison film, which is called Those in Frozen City, and it's amazing, amazing story with fantastic archival material and fantastic music from Alex Summers. And before the film, there will be Q&A, very short and intense, between Bill and film critic Evgeny Gusitinsky. And also, I would like to remind that there is a whole day of sessions and talks and debates tomorrow, and we are very eager to see you tomorrow here again. Thank you very, very much.